Hello and welcome everyone for another edition of Off the Shelf. So today you'll be joining myself, Mehran, Zubair and Fahim to discuss this book, In Place of Fear by Aneurin Bevan. Um, hello Zubair, hello Fahim, how you guys doing?
Great, thanks. Good evening to everyone.
Fantastic. So the reason for the book, I chose it, and yes, it's got lots of reasons, but I guess probably the foremost reason is about his importance in the founding of the National Health Service back in 1946. I think when the National Health Service Act was passed. He's from a South Wales mining community. He joined the Labour Party a few decades prior to the National Health Service Act. And this book was actually first published in 1952 after, I think, a very superbly written chapters. It's only 180 pages, but I found it very relevant to understand the climate then and the importance now. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Zubair for his kind of thoughts about the book itself before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book itself.
Thank you, Mehran. It was it's I guess the first thing is the book for length was obviously quite amenable after last month's book club, being less than 200 pages. I'm sure you guys were happy with that level. It was a tough book, though, I thought, in terms of you had to think about what he was writing, and the language was very much not archaic, but you could tell he was from a different time. But you don't really see people write like that nowadays, in sort of 21st century English prose. Having said that, I'm surprised that I've not come across the book before. So although we've been in the health service for so long and I'd heard of Bevan and heard about his foibles and his exploits over the years, I never realized he'd written a book to describe what he'd done in his time. And the fact he wrote the book quite so soon after the system came into place with the NHS, obviously it was quite enlightening because obviously it kind of gives you an idea about how things were at that time and things are still quite raw. His writing in style in terms of the structure and the topics he covered kind of give you that vibe that he was quite a strong, for me anyway, quite a strong Marxist, but a Democrat also at heart. And I love the fact that he kind of wrote the book in a quite a no-nonsense manner too. So it came quite strongly, his personality, I felt, throughout the book, where he didn't really, for me, he felt as though he didn't really suffer fools, but he understood human character really quite well, understood human weaknesses really quite well. But despite that, had this massive ideal about the national health system and other things too. So it was great to kind of get an insight and his take on things. And he made it quite clear from the off, didn't he, that he wasn't bothered about about him writing his own legacy and his own autobiography, which we find, obviously nowadays you find loads, don't you? Find anybody will write an autobiography if they've done something or the other. Whereas he kind of wasn't really I didn't really know much about himself besides the fact that he was from a South Wales coal mining community. But you learned a lot more about his philosophy and his sort of outtake on life. So I found that quite useful in that regard. So it was good to kind of be finally familiar with his work and actually see what he'd done.
Cool, thank you, Zubair. And Fahim, what were your thoughts following reading this book? As Zubair said, it was much more palatable and shorter than our previous book.
I know, so I won't dwell on that point, but that's a very good point. Obviously, it is a political book. Obviously, the author had political affiliations, and it does touch upon political themes throughout the book. He does give his angle on politics, explaining politics. So it's that, I guess, the blend with medicine and the healthcare and politics is never far away in this book. So it's a bit different to some of the books that we've come across so far in that sense. As Zubair said, some of the language is perhaps a bit difficult, and that might be because the language is from the 50s. So we're obviously this part of 70 years on from there. And so some maybe turns of phrase or just paragraphs would be perhaps written in a different way now. But that doesn't take away from the essence of the book and the main thrust of the points that he is making. and the way that he actually has different chapters which are nicely laid out. And we'll probably come on to the chapters, I guess, during the evening. But really, it does make a lot of sense. And as Zubair said, there's a lot to mull over, think about. But I'm left with this overriding taste of politics after reading this book. Politics, politics, politics. And I think that's never far away from what he's trying to describe. And really, it's useful because we now think about the NHS quite a lot. There's a lot of talk about what the NHS means to people, for some people in terms of values as well, to be British as well. And they associate the NHS with that and other things. And I think it's a very good choice of book, Maran, for that purpose as well. It's timely.
Don't forget, he was a politician at heart, though, wasn't he, for many, many years. And he made it quite clear from the off that even though he was working in the coal mines, he from the off, he was thinking about where does power lie and why is it that I'm here and so is where they are and why have they got power and I don't have power. So it was good to see that sort of him come from that position and then hold one of the highest offices in the land and then talk about this as opposed to always being in a position of privilege and then talking about it, because I think that probably I think it'll probably resound better more with a lot of the population reading his version of events.
Yeah, I think certainly from his part of where he grew up, it didn't feel as though the need for politics and the need to strive for a better place for himself and the community was an individual thing. I think the community all felt that way in terms of how do we improve the situation? How do we influence and where does what road do we need to take to get that power? I think he makes that reference a few times. It was just really interesting how about the author element to the book actually comes right at the end, where we just get a very simple snapshot, very factual account of who he was and what he stood for. But as you said, for him, it's very much a political book. The first chapter, the role of legislature, active or passive. So the way he actually frames the need for movement, the need to voice your opinions, but also a kind of understanding how he knows how markets develop. Reading that first chapter, did you feel there was a drive for that, where he talks about boldness in words must be matched with boldness in deeds, and what does that mean now?
Yeah, I mean, the chapter is, for those who've not read it, poverty, property, and democracy. 3 words which you wouldn't think put together, but obviously make sense. I guess what he's trying to say is that you got to talk the talk, but walk the walk, I guess, in other words, is what he's trying to say. And in what he's trying to say, obviously in getting it. It's quite a short chapter, only about 12 pages. But in that, he does try and explain and set the scene about his political ideology, I guess, to some degree, and what it means. I mean, he's quite powerful in his language. It is nonsense to complain of an immense and tenaciously all-powerful civil service. I mean, there's no mixing there, is there? I mean, you're quite clear in what he's trying to say. So he doesn't mince his words, does he? And that really sets the scene for the whole book.
He doesn't mince his words at all. I think he's very clear in what he believes in, and he's very clear in that this is the way what I believe, and I will try and do what I can to achieve that end. But I think for me, there was an aspect where he was doing this quite selflessly. You could tell that he was in the game of politics, not for personal gain. I don't know about whether that's true of his towards the end, whether or not he made any great amount of money, but I can't imagine him being involved in or minding an expenses scandal. I couldn't imagine him having a second job in Parliament. He's the sort of person that you think is quite principled and feels quite strongly about his role as an MP and in power. So he's quite thingy. But again, he's very straightforward, though. And I don't know, he seems to be quite of a certain genre of politician who maybe isn't really bothered about what people think, but just feel strongly about their own principles. But for some reason, the principles seem to win, and people are happy with that and take towards it.
Yeah. So why do you reckon he wrote this book? I guess it's an opportunity to share his views, and it didn't feel as though it was very well connected, if you know what I mean. It was just an area let's talk about it. That's literally how it felt to me. Why do you think? I'll come to Fahim on this one.
So obviously, in many ways, we see him as the architect of the NHS. So, but that's not the whole book. It's not just about the NHS. So it is there, the Free Health Service, Chapter 5 in the book. So I just wondered if it's to pad that up with some other things, and to actually, because he's talking about socialism, leadership, many different topics in that, as well as the actual title "In Place of Fear," which is quite an interesting title. So I thought it was actually him trying to explore his political viewpoint and explain that to a wider audience with the gambit of having done the NHS. And so that was the vehicle in where he could actually explore and explain his concept of political ideology to the masses, but with an achievement in his pocket. That's what I saw this book to be.
And a bit about the title itself. I know that the previous book was State of Fear. This is, I guess, In Place of Fear is probably meaning, alternative to fear perhaps is hope and movement, or I guess the fight or flight response. Perhaps it's time to fight. What did you make of the title itself?
It's an interesting choice, because I would have thought for him he'd probably pick something a bit of a different tone to it. Maybe talk about workers' rights or poverty or something, but in place of fear, and just the whole wording of that. I don't know. The impression I got was that he'd obviously been thinking about his own background and maybe what he'd seen from people in terms of their own fears of poverty, their fears around their health. And he's basically saying, well, I've done that. I've made a decision to address that for you. And so my whole life in terms of what I've achieved was to replace your fear with an NHS service for your health, or with workers' rights if you don't work somewhere or the other. And there are other fears right now. For example, he touches about, doesn't he, about migration and bits of that order, which obviously are quite topical nowadays. But I can imagine that if he was here today, he'd probably have quite a constructive method of addressing that issue, probably, as opposed to what we have nowadays, sadly. So you get the impression that he's more of a hopeful politician as opposed to a fear-mongering politician. I quite imagine him being the sort to say, "Oh, let's go," and although you could tell he's quite a fighter in that sense. But I quite imagine him agitating for conflict in where people get harmed and hurt. But he's probably more of an individual that you would, if you're poor or if you're impoverished or if you're downtrodden, he'd be in your corner and helping you out. But maybe if you're quite privileged, you probably feel a bit threatened by him because of the way he kind of writes. So my impression from the implicit fear was that side of things, that more about replacing our fear of poverty, replacing our fear of sort of illness and sickness, of workers' rights with actually something can be done about it. And I think that's probably holds true for a lot of things in life, that there are things that maybe we're troubled by or we're struggling with, and they can actually feel overwhelming, but there are actually solutions to these things.
Yeah, it felt like the reason why I wrote this book was to address the universal malaise he talks about quite early in the book itself. That there's real opportunities to make a difference, as well as kind of reinstilling the principles that he stood by. And yeah, I was actually bracing myself to read more about the NHS, but as you know, for him and yourself, Zubair, it's only 1 out of the 10 chapters. But he makes lots of interesting and valid points. I guess one of the things is about prevention, and I think he had a really interesting quote saying, "Preventable pain is a blot on any society, but sickness and often permanent disability arise from failure to take early action." Do you think NHS is primed to address these things, or do we need to do something else?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's the discussion that I think society is having. I think that's a question that's too big for me to answer. I mean, I like that chapter you mentioned, and also, or even paragraph, but even the paragraph after that, where society becomes more wholesome, more serene, and spiritually healthier if it knows that its citizens have at the back of their consciousness the knowledge that not only themselves, but all their fellows have access, when ill, to the best that medical skill can provide. Now, that's a very interesting thing to mention, because that to me is the NHS. So I think it's too big for me to answer that question, because I think we're all grappling with that, because everything comes at a price. We've obviously had the pandemic, and in some ways he talks about contagious diseases. The previous page in the book, he talks about two-tier health service even in that chapter. Even though it's just one chapter, there's a lot of interesting things. He's quite prescient about what happens in the future, and what he thinks is going to happen, which makes it quite interesting 70 years on. But I just say I think that's too big for me to answer the question if it is. But we're just still trying to work out what the NHS means, what it can do, and this whole big machine, what it means for society.
What was your take on that, Zubair?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the chapter is obviously not very long. It's not embellished in any way. And he talks more about how to fund it, and talks about his challenges about whether to set up an insurance scheme or a national health tax or do it through work. He's obviously considered it quite strongly about how this should be funded. And then he talks a lot about, the medical profession and how the BMA especially was quite, antagonistic towards it from its inception. But you don't really get an idea about other things that he wanted from it. He talks about obviously preventative medicine. He talks about the threats of things like prescribing of spectacles and how much that was costing initially. But then he's got the insight there also, where he knows that there's like a huge unmet need, and that's finally being met by the NHS. But then as time goes on, there'll be issues around people maybe not using it the way it was intended to be used. And it looks as though he's obviously caught onto this quite early. And he knows that was going to be a threat from the off. And he talks about the threat of maybe private enterprise, and if you're making money out of something, then within the NHS, then maybe that could be a threat too, and maybe ways of mitigating that risk. It's difficult because obviously this was 1948, a long time ago, a different world after the Second World War, different demands, different expectations. We live in a very different world nowadays. People maybe expect different things of the NHS. They have a different expectation of their health. But I think that the question really is, where do you draw the line? What does NHS do or not do? And I think maybe if he was alive today, he might have a different insight. I do think that his take on it being a health service that was free at the point of demand, but for medical need, is probably for me the crux, because he obviously didn't talk about medical wants. He didn't say that I want X, Y, Z, that's why I will request that. He talks more about medical needs. And I think maybe that's probably where there's the issue around where we are nowadays with the NHS, where people maybe have a different understanding of what it means to them. He's quite clear, though, isn't he, that if anybody does mess about with it, they're not going to survive, politically anyway. If anybody does try to disband it, he just feels as though that will happen. But again, he mentioned that in that chapter also, that even though it was just started a few years prior, already there was legislation taking hold that was compromising the NHS. So even from the off, it's been fighting battles to survive. And I think that probably will always be the case, because it's so ideologically such a splitting area between different individuals. But I think it was great to see his thoughts, though. I mean, I would have liked to have known more, though. I just felt a bit underwhelmed with what he wrote. I got, him writing about different things, but I wanted him to maybe written a bit more about what he thought about the NHS and its conception, and the challenges that he faced, and sort of his aspirations for the future. But it was 21 pages out of the whole book, which is a little bit of the book, but I would imagine there'd be a lot more here. So I think the whole point about him writing the whole book, but going off the NHS as his sort of gambit, probably is true. Maybe he wanted to kind of make people aware that there was more to him than the actual NHS system, and there's more to his political philosophy than just healthcare. But no, it was good to kind of see his viewpoints on it, and it was good to kind of get an idea of how we thought us guys were, and I like the fact they talked about medicine as an art, and how physicians and doctors in the olden days, maybe you couldn't really measure what they were doing, although we try to measure things now, don't we, with targets and stuff like that. But obviously then it was very much an art. Maybe we've lost that, haven't we, I think, over the years. But no, it was good to kind of get his take on it, but I just wish it was a bit longer.
No, he makes that again. It's back in page 79, isn't it? It's the if the job is to be done with regards to um, the thing that the NHS is trying to address, private charity and endowment can meet certain needs, but the state must accept financial responsibility. So he's very clear in some of these ideas and how we'd approach it. But people should be open to change, and I'm sure with time, perhaps he would reflect more on that. Doesn't mean that what he's saying is wrong. It's just there's also an argument that since the financial crisis, this book becomes ever more relevant. Because I think there was concerns that we were going to go down that route again. But some of the terminology had some difficulties accepting, and I guess we have to accept that it was written all those years ago. So things like backward communities, even though he makes those points, he also acknowledges that every community has at any specific time in a different place, and they're in a process of development. And I think he keenly believes that democracy or those principles of socialism are due to be met eventually. But what did you guys think about foreign visitors and how he'd approach? Because I think he kind of touched on Brexit, didn't he?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because he mentions about foreign visitors, and he says, how do we distinguish a visitor from anybody else? Well, I think we have found a way to do that, in all fairness. So he thought that wasn't possible. No, I think we have managed that. Are British citizens to carry means of identification everywhere? Well, he's talking about national ID cards or something, and we've had that discussion as well. So actually, this is where his, I think, clarity of thinking and very fixed idea. Well, he had these questions as if they were rhetorical questions, but actually, no, I think some things we have solved and we can do them. But actually, what he's trying to say that the cost of looking after the visitor doesn't amount to much. And that's an important point that he's saying. Because I think there's been a lot of discussion in the media and other places about this, this concept of free treatment of foreign visitors. And I think there's been compassion by certain quarters of the country, and then maybe some less compassion, should we say, by other quarters. But he's definitely in the compassionate side. And gives you a different angle, which is often explained, about, well, often they're quite healthy people who come to visit, and which I never really thought about. But if you are traveling generally, you shouldn't be really that sick, I guess. You should be quite healthy, so you're probably less inclined to use the health service. And then you're still actually consuming all the services when you go to that nation. And so in a way, you're paying into it. So actually, I never see that being discussed in society. It's always thought about as almost as if a parasite, and just trying to take that. But he's put it into proportion. Explained some things which probably didn't make sense because you can identify who's who, but then actually explained that it's not too much of a toll, and so in that sense, yeah, he's not xenophobic in that sense at all.
I think he mentions, I think, probably more as because it's a fear, isn't it, that people do have, I think, sometimes, that people from other climes coming across may well be parasitic, as he mentioned, on the system and just leeching and taking and not contributing. But in general, most visitors that come to the country will be paying an airport tax when they come in. They'll be paying for hotels, or they're paying for food, for transport, for petrol. They do buffer up our coffers phenomenally. And he's good because he just makes it factual. He doesn't take the emotion out, and he just says, look, the system will cost 39 billion, whatever it was, million pounds, but the foreigners will cost £20,000. It's a pittance compared to what we get out of them when they come over and kind of, contribute towards tourism, or whether it's towards, universities, etc., as students, for example. So I think he's obviously, there's a strong vein in the country, isn't there, of compassion, and compassion towards individuals who are vulnerable, to migrants, to foreigners, to refugees. And I think sometimes that voice gets lost in some of the rhetoric from some of the people that maybe shout the loudest. But I think he talks probably for quite a large majority of the country where he talks about these things actually. And I think he talks about it logically as well, saying that hopefully one day every country will be the same. We'll have the NHS. And if we go there, hopefully we can use their services too. And obviously we had the European health card for a while, didn't we, where we could go to France or Portugal, if something happened, then there'd be some sort of coverage for us if that was the case. And I think there's something just about health being and a health service showing the better lights of the nation. So it can show to anybody that visits that actually there's positiveness within the country, because it's an obvious way to show compassion, an obvious way to show the positive characteristics of a nation. They show compassion towards those that maybe fall ill or vulnerable when they do visit. Because again, how many people visit the country will be looking to go to the hospital? A lot of them visit going to the dungeons of London or seeing the Royal Palace or whatever else. They're not really going to want to go and see, Preston Royal Hospital or Blackburn Royal Hospital, will they? They'd rather go and see other things. But I think it was good for him to mention that, because I think that kind of sadly has been a bit of an issue for some people. I think it's become quite bloated over the time. I love the fact that towards the end, one of his last chapters kind of talks about when visitors visit the country that they find this a bit grey and a bit dull in terms of, and you can't get fancy restaurants, and maybe in their own countries there'll be pockets of affluence and abundance, and it's very very glitzy and glamorous, and then you've got the vast majority aren't doing too well. But he's quite clear that actually we're better in some ways as a nation, that the most impoverished person in our nation probably isn't doing too badly compared to maybe others. So if you went to other parts of the world, then poverty really is very, very depressing, whereas here there's maybe a different level of poverty that maybe people face. Not that it's not there, but it's maybe a different level of that aspect, and maybe the experience may be slightly different. Or you obviously differ according if you wish to anyway for him. But I think it was good though that you mentioned it, because I think it is an important point, and I think people do need to kind of be a bit aware of really where do we stand in terms of what do we actually get from people that visit the country, and if now and again somebody does sadly fall in and requires care, then I think it should be available. Obviously, people always abuse these things, we know that, but that's a minority, I think, compared to what we actually see.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I guess we've kind of touched on this before, but there's the structure of the book itself. I know we've talked about the 10 chapters. Was there anything within that structure that you thought was really interesting for him, and which chapter kind of sticks out for yourself?
Well, definitely the one that sticks out is the free health service, which we've been talking about probably the last 10-15 minutes, because it's talking about our bread and butter, isn't it? Also about where he likes GPs. Obviously, even if they're tempestuous. That's an interesting term. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I think in terms of the structure, I mean, I couldn't really make head or tail of it. I mean, having world leadership and the beginning. I mean, leadership I like at the beginning of things, but that's because leaders are at the front. So I don't know how I couldn't work out the actual chapter headings, democratic socialism at chapter 10. I mean, to me, I couldn't work out. I just thought they were all put together, like I said. And then you got some nice tables at the end. I think the numbers don't make much sense anymore, because we're talking about 39 million pounds, but I'm sure Test and Trace is about 27 billion or something, isn't it? So I mean, the numbers in the health service obviously have no relevance, I would say, to current times, unless just to show you how much it was then, and inflation and other things.
What are your thoughts, Ben? Any specific chapter that springs to mind in the structure of the book itself?
Well, I think obviously we all talked about the health service one, because that's the one that we really have that personal connection to, and probably have a lot more professional personal interest in. Of all of the chapters, I think I was inclined towards the first one, and also towards the last one. I think there was others in between where he talks about other aspects, but his last chapter I thought was quite relevant nowadays, because he talks about certain things about people and how maybe they do things that maybe kind of appeal to their most basic fears. So I think there's things in the last chapter where he talks about certain things where you think, well, actually that's quite relevant nowadays, because people have certain fears, and the present political climate maybe tinkers into that and maybe taps into that a lot more nowadays. So I think that was an important chapter. I loved his first chapter was obviously great, because he talks about this whole poverty and power and that sort of triad, which I've not come across before, but it was good to kind of see that side of things, and how he sees people as there's people with money, there's people that have got lots of powers, and the people, and then there's the politicians, and how do they kind of interact between the three of them. But I would probably go for the last chapter. I mean, it didn't really end it very well for me. It was a bit of a damp squib towards the end, because it wasn't quite, the workers of the world unite, but it wasn't quite, it was kind of like, yeah, we need to kind of become more democratic socialistic, and maybe that's the what we should do, and that's it. But there wasn't really a nice little quote at the end to kind of give it that thing. But I guess it's not a manifesto, it's just a book, and it's just different things of what he's thinking over time that he's just put together. So I didn't really find there was much flaw in the book, unless you guys thought otherwise. I didn't see much of a flaw. It was more different areas that he's just picked up on and just mashed together into a book. That's what I found.
Yeah, looking at the 10 chapters, it felt very much, the first one about poverty, property, and democracy being I think he felt those were the key factors that were going to influence people's lives, as well as you're journeying through politics and making an influence, and then how he kind of brings everything together to democratic socialism, with all the noise and all the challenges in between about social tensions, what's expectation of a modern society, etc., etc. Yeah, I thought the democratic socialism was a really nice, well written chapter. Yeah, it was a bit of an anticlimax because it doesn't really end fantastically, but it's just thinks about the pursuit of power presented itself to us in social and not in personal terms. Just talks about the ethics and values of this individual. You can argue that he just kind of glorified himself, but it doesn't come across that way when you read the book itself. So I thought it was a really interesting read. What did you learn from this book, guys? And any favorite quotes?
So I learned about, obviously, the person who, we can give a lot of credit to the NHS. I learned about his political thoughts, his frame of references. I learned about him in what his belief systems is. I learned really about, I guess, a bit more political knowledge, especially socialism. And just someone living in that time, 70 years ago, how they predicted things to become issues in the future, and whether they were right or wrong. So I learned some sort of things. I think one that was interesting, where he was thinking that so many other countries in the world would copy the NHS. That hasn't happened, and I think we just look around the world, it hasn't happened at all. So as much as we like to say the NHS is great, if it's that good, why aren't everyone else doing it? And I think that's an important question to bear in mind. So because he obviously thought that would happen, and it hasn't. So he's made some grand predictions of what he would expect. They didn't all come to fruition, but that does not undermine his main achievement of doing the NHS, which is the jewel in his crown. He's done that with opposition from doctors. He mentions that, and I think the three of us as doctors, we need to have some humble pie that, many doctors, it seems, were opposed to this system. So morally, we are coming from a point of disadvantage when we look at this book. We have to look at it with humility, as saying, not all doctors agreed with this concept of an NHS. So it makes me think of humility. Yes, happy to work in the NHS. Interesting, other countries aren't copying it. The doctors were against this. A lot of mixed sort of emotions when you read this book, and they don't all fit very nicely together. But maybe that's a maxim of the book. It doesn't fit all nicely together either, but neither do the emotions that it provoke in us. Don't fit nicely in us either.
Thanks, Vaim. What about you, Zubair?
I think from what I can gather from the book and from what I read of Bevan previously, there's a compassionate kindness about a lot of his work, and you get the strong impression when you read his speeches and the book itself that he's off this school of thought which is very much about helping people and being compassionate to those who are weak, or maybe impoverished or vulnerable. So there's something very warm about what he writes about, and it makes you feel hopeful when he says what he does do. But we tend to find that people that have those views and espouse those views, it tends to be quite idealistic, and you rarely find that if it comes to fruition and those ideas ever become reality. But I think the fact that it just happened, for me, is a bit of I think it's a great achievement for me. I think it's a bit of a mini miracle that it actually happened, because the fact that no other nation really has anything like this, unless I'm mistaken, kind of shows how well he did. Because for him to have actually achieved this is remarkable. And the fact that it's lasted so long is also quite remarkable, because the foundations were so strong and the buy-in from the public was so strong, and the fact that it's worked so well. Because if it didn't work well, it wouldn't be here. I don't think this would have gone on as long as it has done so if it didn't quite work. And the fact that others haven't taken it, got on, I think is in some ways quite sad, I guess, and also, but I guess it just reflects on how well he achieved and how well he did to get it off the ground. So there's something about being idealistic, but actually you can at times have ideals, but and we feel as sometimes that people just, well, that's never happened in reality. That'll never become reality, and there's just too many things that mean that won't occur. But maybe those that maybe have ideals that maybe don't seem to be quite embedded in realism, but maybe appeal to our inner goodness, maybe could take hope and heart from this book. That actually something like the NHS, is something that's literally nothing. Everything's against it. The medics are against it. The people with money are against it. Everybody that matters is against it, but it still came to fruition. So there are things that maybe we feel as though could be better nowadays. There are things that we see in our societies that maybe we'd hope were much better and maybe would be far improved. But we fear that what we see means that it'll never occur, that we'll never see a world where that goodness can come. But actually, this gives me hope, I think, that actually that can occur. That sometimes you can have ideals that maybe feel as though aren't there, and there's too many things against it, but actually it can occur. But it might just take a bit of determination, a bit of understanding, and a leap of faith to make that occur.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how he talked about health inequalities, and the broader that gap becomes, the less committed people are in trying to address the inequality itself. I can relate to how the free service, let's say for example in parts of South Asia where the actual government-backed health system is really impoverished, whereas the majority of the middle and upper class are very much focused on private healthcare. There's no desire or need to fix that imbalance. So I think he kind of warns about where health inequalities and the broader that gap becomes the consequences of that. I just wonder whether there's an argument to say that the health inequalities aren't as big here as other parts of the world. But that's not me saying that that's the case, but it's just another angle to understand this difficulty. But nevertheless, inequalities do exist, and I can see that in the places where I work. If you just live a mile down the road, your life expectancy is about 10 to 15 years different. So I thought it was a fascinating book. I kind of understand why my mentor during my last year of training recommended this, because he lives in, I've got utmost respect for him, and I'm glad that I've read this book. I think I've read this about 4 times now. So every time I've read it, it's just kind of reinstilling those kind of values about that hope. It's something that I really enjoyed. So out of 5, guys, the customary scoring time.
So it's an interesting one, isn't it? The scoring of 5, it's such a hard, objective way of measuring a book. Look at me trying to sit on the fence. I think.
Did you not introduce it, Fahim?
No. I think. Yeah, I did. Yeah. I think for this book, I'd probably give it 3.5 out of 5, and let me explain why that is. I think we've all agreed that the chapters are a mishmash. Okay, so that's one thing. I mean, we're left with a lot of tables and things there. Over 3 because I do recommend it for other people to read. But it's lacking the finesse of a 4 and a 5, I'm afraid, guys, for me. So I think it sits as a nice 3.5. And it gets that extra half for being accessible with the word count as well, and the number of pages, which makes it a nice coffee table book as well. I probably wouldn't read it 4 times, I myself. But I would definitely, once or twice. And I'm glad you gave it to me, Mehran, and suggested it for me to read, as I did learn some nice, interesting quotes which will remain with me. So 3.5 out of 5.
Cool, fantastic. Zubair?
That's impressive thing from you. I think as a literary work, it's not going to be one of those that you think, wow, this you're going to get a lot out of it on that level. But I think from as the person who's written the book, and what he's achieved, and what he's done, I think it obviously requires a lot more from me anyway. Just the person himself will give me a higher level of respect. I'm just a bit disappointed, like I said, that the health chapter was truncated as far as I'm concerned. I'd love to have known a bit more about what happened there, and maybe had 200 pages really of that to kind of just really get the nitty gritty. But I'm going to give it a 4, because I just think there's that I think just the fact that he's taken the time out of his life to actually write the book, and the fact that it's such an inspiration, and because there are people write books and people are taught to be meant to be thought of as being inspiration, but for me, Bevan is genuinely inspiration. He's genuinely something that's come out and created something that we've all benefited from. All of us can put hands on our heart and say we have ourselves, our family members have benefited. We could have had loved ones, especially in the pandemic, and had massively costly bills for COVID if they went to ICU, for example, or other things. But because of his generosity and because of his fight and commitment, we're today, it's not our worry. None of us worries about healthcare. None of us worries about healthcare bills. And that's the beauty of what he's done. We'll worry about waiting times. We'll worry about it takes so long to get through to make an appointment at the hospital with the GP. But nobody will ever say, I can't afford it. And I think that's the beauty of what he's achieved. I think for me, that's why he'll get a 5. He would have got a 4 rather. He would have got a 5 if it was better constructed.
That was a bit anticlimax after that statement.
If it was better written, it would have been thingy. But like I said, if it was somebody else, honestly, 2, to be honest. But I think because of what he's achieved, that just deserves more credit.
On that basis, he would get a 5 for the.
Yeah.
But you're changing the rules of how we judge a book now.
Gosh, I'd love to see who you'd give 5 out of 5 of. No, but I'd fully understand where you're coming from, and so even to be honest, I'll be giving him 4 out of 5. As you said, it's not literacy masterpiece, but it's just I love the way he actually just put his views forward. Just means that his language is so accessible, and just more politicians write in such a way. Perhaps they do, and I haven't. Actually had the opportunity to read it, but if anyone's out there and listening and any books to recommend, please do let us know. Happy to look into it. And yeah, so I guess our next book, Fahim, over to you to introduce. Nice.
Yeah, so the next book is Eric Berne's classic, The Games People Play. Again, another old book. It talks about the psychology of human relationships, over 5 million copies sold. The book is about playing games and relationships that we all do in different workplaces, out of the workplace. It's written by a psychiatrist, so that's why I hope, Mehran, you'll find it appealing. I'm expecting a high mark from you. Really, it was recommended to me by a colleague several years ago. And I think we've done that a few times in the book club, is go with recommendations from colleagues. And it's taught me some things. I'm a game player myself. I like playing games, as you both know. And so hopefully once you read this, you'll see how if I've started doing games or not. But actually, who doesn't like games? So I hope it's quite a quick jaunt, It's not too many pages. So hopefully it's something that we'll all be able to do. And we're hoping to discuss that soon, I think December 15th.
Fantastic. Depends what games, Fahim? The PlayStation or the Xbox. Exactly. But yeah, no, it looks a great book. I've already started it, so we're looking forward to it. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for sharing your Sunday evening, and we look forward to discussing your book next time. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.